They clapped when I walked in. 16 people, standing up, glasses already half empty, applauding me like I'd just come home from a war zone instead of a 3-year silence they'd built themselves. And underneath that applause, my father was already smiling the smile of a man who thought he'd just won something. He had no idea that in about 90 minutes, his own credit card was going to stand up in front of that entire table and call him a liar 3 separate times. Stick around, because by the end of this, you're going to understand exactly why I let it happen. I'm Vanessa. I'm 32 years old, and I run the entire back-end operation for a restaurant group, 4 locations, close to 3,000 covers a week between them. I know food cost percentages the way most people know their own phone number. I know how a kitchen breathes during a Friday rush, how a floor manager's face changes the second a table starts getting difficult, how a check can be a weapon if you hand it to the wrong person at the wrong moment. So when my mother texted me out of a 3-year silence and asked me to come to dinner so we could heal, I had exactly one question I should have asked before I said yes. Who else is going to be at that table? I didn't ask it. And that mistake cost me a 40-minute drive, a parking lot full of cars I recognized, and a seat at the far end of a table already buried in lobster tails, wagyu steaks, and a $400 bottle of wine somebody had already started pouring before I'd even found a place to park. My father looked up from the head of that table like he owned the room, smiled at me the way he used to smile right before asking me to co-sign something, and said the sentence he thought was going to end the night exactly how he wanted it to end. "You're paying, right? You owe us that much." He had absolutely no idea what was coming. Welcome to the channel, if this is your first time here. I tell true stories about ordinary people who get pushed into impossible corners by the people who are supposed to love them the most, and who somehow, against every instinct that's been trained into them, manage to walk out the other side with their spine still intact. If you've ever been the one person in your family who's expected to fix everything, pay for everything, and then stay quiet about it afterward, this one's for you. Drop where you're watching this from in the comments, and go ahead and subscribe now, because you're absolutely going to want to see how this dinner ends. But before we get to the parking lot, before the 16 chairs and the wine and the moment my father's face went white in front of his entire family, I need you to understand exactly who I was the morning that invitation landed in my phone. Because the version of me that walked into that restaurant was not the version they remembered. They just hadn't figured that out yet. I didn't inherit this job. I built it, one exhausting shift at a time, starting when I was 17 years old, bussing tables at a steakhouse back in Knoxville, coming home every night reeking of fryer grease and stale coffee. I hostessed at 19, waited tables at 21, made floor manager by 24. And by the time I turned 30, I was sitting in an office with the title Regional Operations Director stenciled on the door, overseeing 4 separate locations, 60-some employees, and enough moving parts that most days felt like conducting an orchestra that was one bad night away from falling apart. I'm not wealthy, not by the version of wealthy people imagine when they hear restaurant executive. I own a modest 2-bedroom condo, paid off, no mortgage hanging over my head. I've got a retirement account I never ever touch. And I have exactly one indulgence when I eat out, and it's not champagne, it's not truffle anything, it's sparkling water. Still or bubbles, doesn't matter, that's what I order, every single time, without fail. My staff thinks it's just a quirky habit of mine. It's not a quirk. It's armor. When you spend your entire childhood covering everyone else's steak dinner, you learn very quickly to keep your own tab small enough that you can walk away from it without a second thought. You learn to never owe the table anything, because the second you do, somebody's going to remind you of it. The morning the text came in, I was sitting in my office reviewing an import contract for olive oil, buried in the kind of mundane Tuesday paperwork that makes you forget that not everyone else's day is running on spreadsheets and par levels. My phone buzzed against the desk. I glanced down, and something ice-cold settled in behind my ribcage before I even understood why. 3 years of dead silence, and there it was. A notification from a group chat I'd been kicked out of the same day I became the villain of my own family story. Family had added me back. I stared at that notification for a solid minute before I opened it. Family. The little red heart my mother had picked out for the group icon 6 years earlier, back when that chat was just for sharing Thanksgiving recipes and pictures of my sister's dog. I hadn't seen that heart in 3 years. And when I finally opened it, the chat history above her newest message was completely empty. Which meant one of 2 things: either they'd wiped it clean before adding me back in, or, far more likely, there had been an entirely separate group chat running this whole time, one I was never part of. One where they'd been talking about me the entire time I thought I'd simply been erased. My mother's message was warm. Careful. It read like something she'd drafted and redrafted before hitting send. She said she and my father had been doing a lot of reflecting, and they wanted to invite me to dinner at a restaurant called the Camarel so we could start healing as a family. Just the four of us, she wrote. Me, your father, Brooke, and you. A small dinner. A fresh start. 30 seconds later, a second message landed, and this one told me everything I needed to know, if only I'd been paying attention. Family takes care of family, sweetheart. It's time we remembered that. I want you to sit with that phrase for a second, because it is going to matter later. Family takes care of family. My mother used that exact sentence when I was 19, and she needed my server tips to cover the electric bill. She used it when I was 23, and my father needed someone to co-sign on a truck loan. She used it when my sister's first apartment fell through, and I quietly, silently covered her deposit without ever being asked to explain why. In my house, that sentence had never once meant what it sounded like. It had one translation, and only one. Vanessa takes care of family. I read her message twice. And what struck me wasn't what she said, it was what she didn't say. There was no, I'm sorry. No, we were wrong. Just, it's time to heal, passive voice, no subject, nobody actually responsible for anything. I typed back 3 words. I'll be there. Then I set the phone face down on my desk, picked my pen back up, and went right back to that olive oil contract, pretending my hands weren't shaking while I did it. To understand why 3 years of silence hit different than it should have, you need to know what happened right before it started. 3 years earlier, my sister Brooke decided she was going to open a cafe. Not a business plan. Not a single hour of market research. A cafe because she'd walked into some place in Charleston with exposed brick and a matcha menu and thought, I could do that too. She was 26. She had never managed so much as a lemonade stand in her life. And she needed a $75,000 small business loan to make it happen. The bank would only approve it with a cosigner. That cosigner was supposed to be me. My mother called on a Sunday afternoon. My father sat right next to her, arms already crossed, already irritated before I'd even said hello. Brooke needed this loan. It was her dream. And I had good credit, a stable career, and, this part was implied but very much understood, a long, reliable history of saying yes. Just sign the papers, Vanessa. I asked to see her business plan. She didn't have one. I asked about projected margins, lease terms, supplier contracts. My sister looked at me like I'd just insulted her cooking personally. My mother's voice went flat and hard. She's your sister. You don't need a spreadsheet to love your sister. I said no. Not because I didn't love Brooke, I did, and I still do. But I had spent over a decade in this industry watching hopeful people pour their entire savings into concepts with absolutely no foundation underneath them, and I knew, with total certainty, exactly what $75,000 of someone else's debt looks like at 3 in the morning when the cafe is sitting dark and the payments still due. My father stood up from the table. He pointed at the front door, and he said the sentence that would seal off 3 years of my life. If you won't help this family, you're not part of it. I drove home that night in complete silence. And by the next morning, I'd been removed from the group chat. Nobody called to explain. Nobody texted to check in. For 3 straight years, I was simply the daughter who apparently loved money more than her own sister. Here's the part that's genuinely hard for me to admit out loud, even now. That silence very nearly broke me. Not because any part of me believed they were right, I knew they weren't. It broke me because I missed being needed. That was the real wound underneath everything, and it took me 2 full years and a therapist named Dr. Kwan to name it correctly. I'd been the family fixer since I was 17 years old. My very first paycheck went straight to groceries. My first tax refund covered my mother's dental work. When my dad's transmission blew out, I quietly paid for the entire rebuild and told him it was covered under warranty, because I knew, without question, that he would never accept a handout from his 22-year-old daughter. When Brooke got married, I covered the florist, the photographer, and half the reception hall, and I smiled the entire time my mother stood up and gave a toast about raising 2 strong, independent girls. 2 strong girls. 1 bill. I didn't do any of it because I was generous by nature. I did it because somewhere around age 15, I learned that the fastest way to keep peace in that house was to make absolutely sure nobody ever had to ask me twice. Ask once, Vanessa pays, everyone's happy, dinner stays quiet. I trained them without meaning to. I taught my own parents that my wallet functioned like a vending machine, insert guilt, receive check. And when that machine finally jammed, when it finally set out of order, they didn't bother troubleshooting it. They just unplugged it and walked away. So when my mother's message showed up after 3 years of nothing, family takes care of family, sweetheart, I felt that old reflex ignite in my chest like a muscle that hadn't been stretched in years. Go fix it. Pay whatever it costs. Make it quiet again. But underneath that reflex, I also heard Dr. Kwan's voice, steady as a metronome in the back of my skull. You taught them you would always pay. That's the mistake you need to fix, not by paying more, but by finally stopping. My coworker Jess told me flat out not to go. We were sitting across from each other at lunch the day after the invitation landed, and she said, "Vanessa, this has ambush written all over it in permanent marker." I actually laughed, because Jess had never once met a single member of my family, and yet she could see the shape of it clearer than I could. My sous chef Marco echoed the same thing in about 4 words. Boss, don't. Just don't. But I'd already made up my mind. Not because I doubted either of them, I didn't. Not because I expected some tearful apology at the table. I wanted to sit across from my parents one more time and finally find out whether 3 years apart had actually changed anything, or whether that silence had simply been a longer, quieter version of the exact same conversation we'd always had. The one where I listen, I agree, and then I pay. I wanted closure. Even if closure just meant confirming, once and for all, that the door really was nailed shut. And there was something else underneath all of it, something I'm going to be honest about, because I think a lot of you are going to recognize this feeling. I missed my mother. Not the version of her who orchestrated things behind the scenes, who kept score of every favor. I missed the mother who taught me how to make cornbread in a cast iron skillet when I was 9 years old, singing along to old country records while the butter melted on the stove. That version of her hadn't called in 3 years either. But some nights, if I sat still long enough, I could still hear that song in the back of my head. So I told Jess I was going. I told Marco I'd be fine. I told myself the same thing, and I almost believed it. I set one rule for the night. One dinner. Stay civil. No money changes hands. And if the whole thing started to feel wrong, I was walking out before dessert even hit the table. I actually wrote it down, one dinner, then home, on a sticky note, and I pressed it right onto my steering wheel the morning I drove over. That sticky note was still sitting there, right on the wheel, when I pulled into the Camarel's parking lot and started counting cars. I dressed plain on purpose. Black slacks, a gray blouse I usually wear to vendor meetings, flat shoes, no jewelry except the small silver watch I bought myself the year I made regional director, not to impress anyone, just because I'd earned it, and it kept good time. I didn't want to walk in looking like I was performing wealth. My family already believed, wrongly, that I flaunted my success. The actual truth was I drove a 9-year-old sedan and meal prepped on Sundays like half the country does. The drive took exactly 40 minutes. No music. Hands locked at 10 and 2 the entire way. Somewhere around the highway merge, my stomach started tightening in a way I recognized instantly, the same feeling I get right before a walk in cooler dies on a packed Friday night, when your body already knows the next few hours are going to hurt before your brain's caught up to the fact. I almost turned around at the exit ramp. Almost. But I thought about the cornbread. I thought about Dr. Kwan's voice. And I kept driving. The Camarel sat at the end of a strip of upscale shops I hadn't visited in years, the expensive side of town, the kind of place where the parking lot is professionally landscaped and the hostesses all wear black. I spotted my father's truck in the 3rd row. My mother's sedan parked right beside it. Fine, so far, exactly what I expected. Then I saw my Aunt Linda's white Buick. My Uncle Greg's SUV. Brooke's hatchback, still wearing the bumper sticker from her cafe, the one that had shut down 11 months after it opened. 3 more cars I recognized on sight. 2 I didn't recognize at all. My stomach dropped before I'd even touched the door handle. Just the 4 of us, my mother had written. I counted 9 separate vehicles in that lot. I sat there for 2 full minutes with the engine off, hands still on the wheel, reading that sticky note over and over. One dinner, then home. The smart move, the obviously correct move, would have been to reverse straight back out of that lot and drive 40 minutes home to a bowl of leftover soup and never think twice about whatever family reunion I clearly hadn't been properly invited to. I got out of the car anyway. I straightened my blouse. I locked the doors and walked toward the entrance. Because I was 32 years old, I had spent 3 entire years learning how not to run from things, and I was not about to start running again in a restaurant parking lot on an ordinary Thursday evening. The front doors were heavy glass set into brass handles, the kind of doors that quietly announce entrees starting at $42 before you've even opened a menu. Inside, the lobby smelled like rosemary, warm bread, and money. A hostess in a black dress glanced at her screen. Mayfield? I nodded. She gave me a small, knowing smile, the exact expression hostesses wear after they've spent an hour managing a difficult large party and are trying very hard not to let it show. I recognized that look instantly. I've worn it myself more times than I can count. "Your party's already seated," she said, and led me toward the back of the dining room. I heard them before I ever saw them. Laughter. Glasses clinking together. My Aunt Linda's unmistakable cackle cutting straight through the general hum of the restaurant. One dinner, then home. I turned the corner and there was the table. 16 chairs, every single one occupied except the empty seat waiting at the far end, positioned directly across from my father. The table ran the entire length of a private dining alcove, white linen, heavy silverware, low crystal candle holders down the center. And spread across every inch of that tablecloth were platters I could identify from 10 feet away without even trying, lobster tails fanned out over crushed ice, wagyu sliders stacked on a tiered stand, a charcuterie board the size of a small coffee table. And right in the center of it all, a bottle of wine I recognized instantly from vendor tastings, a 2016 bottle that retails around $400, already half emptied. They'd been here a while. They'd been ordering hard. The hostess paused at the edge of the alcove, glanced sideways at me with an expression that translates identically across every restaurant on earth, "Good luck," and leaned in to murmur something private. "Your father put a card down to hold the reservation, just so you're aware. We require one for parties over 12. I filed that detail away instantly, the same way I file every operational detail that crosses my desk, silently, completely, permanently. His card was on file. He had secured this reservation. And yet somehow I already understood, standing there in that doorway, that the bill sitting at the end of this meal was never actually meant to land on him. My mother spotted me first. She shot up out of her chair with both arms flung wide open, and every single head at that table turned in my direction at once. "Vanessa. Oh, sweetheart, look at you." Applause. Actual, honest-to-God applause, like I was a soldier returning from deployment, and not the daughter they'd erased for exactly 1,095 days. My Uncle Greg let out a whistle. Aunt Linda dabbed at her eyes with a cloth napkin. Brooke raised her wine glass in my direction and smiled, the kind of smile that shows plenty of teeth and absolutely zero warmth behind it. 16 people. Lobster and wagyu and a $400 bottle of wine. Just the four of us, my mother had promised in writing. I sat down. What else do you do when 16 people are watching, the chair's already been pulled out for you, and a waiter is pouring water into your glass before your purse has even hit the floor? I sat and I smiled, because 15 years of front-of-house training gives you exactly that skill, the ability to smile warmly while your brain is running a full-thread assessment in the background at maximum speed. My mother settled back into her chair, beaming with pride. We wanted it to be a surprise. The whole family together, just like old times. "I thought it was just the four of us," I said. She waved a hand through the air like she was brushing away a fly. "Well, once Linda heard, and then Greg, and then your cousin Tara, it just grew. You know how family gets." Oh, I knew exactly how family gets. I scanned down the table. My father sat at the head, carving into a wagyu slider like it was a Thanksgiving turkey. Brooke sat to his left, phone in one hand, wine glass in the other, thumb scrolling through something I couldn't see. Aunt Linda and Uncle Greg anchored the middle of the table. Cousins I hadn't spoken to since a holiday gathering 5 years prior filled the remaining seats. Tyler, Megan, Jake, 2 wives I'd only met once each, and Aunt Linda's next-door neighbor, someone I had genuinely never laid eyes on before, apparently eating lobster on an occasion that had absolutely nothing to do with her. The wine kept flowing. The platters were already half demolished. This table had clearly been running for at least an hour before I ever arrived, ordering their way through everything on that menu that didn't require a second mortgage to afford. My mother reached across and squeezed my hand. "See? Family takes care of family." There it was again. The exact same 5 words, wrapped in the exact same warm packaging, aimed at the exact same target. I squeezed her hand back and said nothing at all. I was already counting plates. My father is the type of man who orders for the table, never asks orders. He waved the waiter over, a young guy who looked barely out of his teens, running purely on caffeine and nerves, and rattled off an entire round of additions without so much as glancing at a menu. "Another round of the lobster tails. 2 more wagyu plates. And bring another bottle of that Bordeaux," he said, loud enough that the neighboring tables definitely heard him. "The good one. The good one," said at full volume, like a magic phrase. My father pulled a credit card out of his wallet and held it between 2 fingers, the way a magician shows the audience a coin right before the trick starts. "Put it all on this," he told the waiter. "We're celebrating tonight." The waiter, his name tag read Nathan, scribbled the order and disappeared toward the kitchen with the exact look of a 19-year-old who badly needs a cigarette break he isn't going to get. I watched my father tuck that card back into his wallet with a little satisfied pat, the way you'd pat a dog that had just performed a trick correctly. And something felt off immediately. I grew up watching this man argue over the price of a replacement muffler. I watched him return a shirt once because the sale tag had fallen off. Raymond Mayfield does not order $400 bottles of wine. He does not wave credit cards around like a flag at a parade. This was theater. And it was aimed directly at me. Look how well we're doing without you, Vanessa. Look how little we ever needed you. Except his truck sitting out in that lot was the exact same one from 5 years ago, dented rear quarter panel and all, still unrepaired. And my mother's purse, resting on the chair beside her, was the same Coach bag she'd carried since I was in high school, strap held together with a safety pin. They were performing. I just hadn't figured out the ticket price yet. The small jab started right around the second bottle of wine. Aunt Linda leaned across Uncle Greg and said, "Must be nice, running all those fancy restaurants while the rest of us are clipping coupons," and laughed the exact way people laugh when they very much mean what they just said. Cousin Megan asked if I ever felt guilty living so comfortably while my parents were going through such a rough patch. Nobody had ever mentioned a rough patch to me. Brooke, not even looking up from her phone, added, "She wouldn't know. She hasn't exactly been around." Each comment landed with the precision of something rehearsed, not scripted, exactly, but aligned, the way a choir somehow lands the same note without a conductor standing in front of them. They had clearly been talking about me, my absence, my money, my life. And they'd all arrived at this dinner sharing the exact same understood story. Vanessa left. Vanessa has plenty. Vanessa owes. Aunt Linda delivered what amounted to the thesis statement of the entire evening. She reached across the table, took my hand like she was comforting me at a funeral, and said, "Family doesn't keep score, dear." I almost laughed out loud. This from a woman who once stopped speaking to her own daughter-in-law for 6 full months over a seating chart at Thanksgiving. I didn't laugh. I gently pulled my hand back and picked up my glass instead. Sparkling water. The only thing on the table in front of me. The only thing I'd actually ordered. The contrast was almost funny if you thought about it too long. 16 people swimming in lobster and Bordeaux, and me sitting at the far end with a glass of sparkling water like the designated driver at somebody else's bachelor party. Nathan passed behind my chair and caught my eye. "Just the water tonight?" he asked, quiet enough that only I could hear it. "Just the water," I confirmed. He nodded like he understood something I hadn't said out loud. Let me tell you a little about Nathan, because he matters to this story more than you'd think. He was maybe 19 or 20, built thin in that way restaurant kids are before they learn to grab meals between rushes. He moved fast, but carefully, the way new servers move when a table's too big, the order's too complicated, and they know one wrong plate means a conversation with the manager they can't afford to have. I recognized every single thing about him, because I was him once. 17 years old, 2 tables deep in the weeds, learning the hard way that the guests who snap their fingers at you are always, without fail, the worst tippers in the room. He was running our entire 16 top essentially alone. A busser drifted in occasionally to clear plates, but Nathan was handling every order, every refill, every "excuse me, can we get more butter" from Aunt Linda, who'd already said that exact sentence 3 separate times in 20 minutes. He never complained once. Never sighed. Refilled my sparkling water without ever being asked. And when he set the glass back down, he caught me watching the table with an expression I clearly hadn't hidden well enough. "Long night," he murmured. I almost told him the truth right then. Instead, I just said, "You're doing great." He blinked, genuinely startled, like he'd forgotten customers were even capable of saying something like that. Then he stood up about half an inch taller and moved on toward Uncle Greg's empty glass. I watched him go and thought about the version of myself who used to stack 4 plates up one forearm and cry quietly in the walk-in freezer on the worst nights. That girl had no idea she'd eventually end up sitting on the other side of a table exactly like this one, across from the very family that turned her into a fixer and a funder, being asked, without technically being asked, to write one more check. But she'd have understood exactly what I was about to do. She'd have understood it completely. I excused myself to the restroom around the 40-minute mark. I needed 2 minutes without Aunt Linda's running commentary and a door I could actually lock behind me. The Camarel's restroom had cloth hand towels, lavender soap, and a full-length mirror engineered to make everyone look slightly better than they feel, which, considering I currently felt like I was digesting broken glass, was an impressive trick. I ran the tap and pressed cold water against my wrists, the way you do when you need your heart rate to cooperate with the rest of your body. Then I noticed it. A phone sitting on the edge of the marble counter, screen still lit up, case covered in little daisy stickers. Brooke's phone. She must have set it down and forgotten it on her way out, distracted by something else. Leaving things behind everywhere she went was one of maybe 3 traits we actually shared. I hadn't planned on looking. I need that to be clear. But the screen was bright, and the notification banner sitting at the top was from a group chat I had never once been added to, and the preview text underneath, it was enough to freeze my hand halfway to the paper towel dispenser. The group was named Dinner Plan. 3 members. My mother. My father. Brooke. The most recent message, sent 4 days earlier, was from my mother, and I can still recite it from memory, word for word. Don't tell Vanessa it's everyone. She won't dare say no. The preview cut off right there at the edge of the banner. My pulse stayed steady. My hands stayed dry. I picked that phone up the exact same way I'd pick up a vendor invoice that didn't add up correctly, not angry, not shocked, just confirming what the numbers had already been quietly telling me. I scrolled up. The full message read, "Don't tell Vanessa it's everyone. Once she's there and the whole family's watching, she won't dare say no. She never could handle a scene." Beneath it, my father had replied, "Just make sure she sits at my end. I'll handle the ask." Brooke's contribution landed 2 minutes after that. Order the good stuff before she gets here. Once it's on the table, she can't exactly send it back. LOL. I kept scrolling. 3 full weeks of messages. My mother coordinating the guest list. Linda's in. Greg's in. Megan says yes if there's wine. My father, quieter throughout, mostly handling logistics, parking, reservation times, how to phrase the invitation so it sounded casual instead of orchestrated. And then the messages that turned my stomach genuinely cold. My mother, 10 days earlier. The bank called again Thursday. We need to figure something out before June. My father's reply, Vanessa can cover us through spring. She's got more than enough. And then the one that hit me like a shelf collapsing. My mother again, 8 days ago. It's not asking for money. It's letting her back into the family. She should be grateful we're even giving her this chance. Grateful. They wanted me to feel grateful for the privilege of being tricked into a 16-person dinner at a restaurant I never would have chosen for myself, so I could quietly cover a bill nobody had told me was coming. To solve a financial crisis nobody had bothered explaining to me, for a family that had cut me off completely the last time I said no. I set Brooke's phone back down on the counter exactly where I'd found it, screen facing down. I washed my hands slowly. I looked at myself in that flattering mirror and thought, clearly and calmly, I know exactly what you're doing. And I know exactly what it's going to cost me if I let it happen. And for the first time in 15 years, I decided I was not going to pay it. I stood in that bathroom holding the whole truth in both hands, and the strangest part was how calm I felt underneath it. Not numb. Not furious. Just clear, the way a kitchen goes completely silent right before a dinner rush, every station in position, nothing wasted, everyone ready. If you've ever discovered you were loved for what you could provide rather than who you actually are, you already know exactly how cold that tile floor felt under my shoes right then. Stay with me here, and go ahead and hit that subscribe button now, because what I planned in the time it took to dry my hands is exactly what you came here to watch. I walked back out to that table wearing the same expression I use when a health inspector shows up unannounced, pleasant, unreadable, fully operational. Nobody at that table noticed a single thing had changed. Aunt Linda was mid-story about a neighbor's divorce. Uncle Greg was 3 lobster tails deep. Brooke had reclaimed her phone from the restroom and gone straight back to scrolling, completely oblivious. But I noticed things now that I hadn't let myself see 30 minutes earlier. My mother kept glancing sideways at my father's wallet sitting on the table, quick little flicks of her eyes, like she was watching a countdown timer. My father's laugh was pitched half a beat too loud each time, the specific laugh of a man who's nervous and covering it with volume. That second bottle of wine was nearly empty, and not a single person at that table had suggested slowing down, because why would they? They weren't paying. I was. That was the entire point of this evening. Every lobster tail, every wagyu slider, every pour of that $400 Bordeaux was one more brick in a wall they were quietly building around me, tall enough that I couldn't climb back out without causing exactly the kind of scene I'd spent my whole life avoiding. So I started asking questions. Casual ones. The kind you ask when you're genuinely catching up after 3 years apart, not the kind you ask when you already know the real answer and you're simply watching someone decide whether to lie to your face. How's the cafe doing, Brooke? Her wine glass paused halfway to her mouth. Oh, we closed. Market just wasn't there. She said it fast, like ripping off a bandage she'd clearly rehearsed removing. That's a shame. How long did it run? 11 months. My mother jumped in before the silence could settle. Brooke's exploring other options right now. She has so many talents. I nodded and turned toward my father. How's the contracting business, Dad? Still doing the commercial builds? His jaw tightened, just barely, for half a second, a tell I'd been cataloging since long before I had a driver's license. Between projects at the moment. Economy's been rough. You know how it is. I did know how it was. I knew because I just read the bank called again Thursday on his wife's phone 10 minutes earlier. I knew because that dent in his truck was still sitting there, unrepaired. And I knew because the man who had just ordered 2 full rounds of lobster and a $400 bottle of wine was sitting across from me performing solvency the way a community theater actor performs Shakespeare, loud, committed, and entirely unconvincing to anybody who'd ever seen the real thing up close. I just nodded and let them keep talking. People tell you absolutely everything once they think you're the bank. They told me about the kitchen renovation they'd put on indefinite hold. About skipping their vacation this year. About things being a little tight, but nothing we can't handle. Every single sentence was a window into a house that was quietly on fire, while everyone stood on the lawn insisting the smoke was just barbecue. The pressure in my family never arrives as a direct question. It arrives as a current, small comments pushing in the same direction, each one casual enough to deny individually, but coordinated enough to corner you completely. Aunt Linda sighed dramatically. It must be so rewarding, doing well for yourself like that. Some of us just aren't as lucky. Cousin Tyler, someone I hadn't spoken to since roughly 2 presidential terms ago, chimed in with, "Yeah, Vanessa, you really landed on your feet. That's awesome." Even Uncle Greg, a man who typically communicates exclusively in sports metaphors, managed a solemn, "You really hit a home run out there, kid." Each compliment functioned as another brick, and every single one pointed in the exact same direction. You have money, we see it, and we are reminding you of that fact in front of witnesses. My mother orchestrated the whole thing from the center of the table like a conductor who had the entire score memorized, a nod toward Linda here, a smile toward Tyler there, a gentle steadying hand on my father's arm whenever he tried to speak too soon. She was good at this. She'd always been good at this. I used to believe my mother was simply a warm person who liked hosting large gatherings. I understood now that she was, and probably always had been, a project manager with a 20-year track record, and her single biggest ongoing project was sitting quietly at the end of the table with a glass of sparkling water. Dessert menus arrived. Aunt Linda ordered creme brulee without so much as glancing at the price. Brooke ordered a chocolate soufflé, which requires a full 20-minute lead time to prepare, meaning she'd placed that order before I'd even sat down at the table. Of course she had. They were running that tab up exactly the way people run up a tab when someone else is footing the bill, no ceiling in sight, zero guilt, not one glance toward the right-hand column of the menu. My sparkling water had melted down to ice. Brooke was the one who finally cracked the surface. She'd had 3 full glasses of that Bordeaux by then, enough to sand down whatever filter she kept between her brain and her mouth, which admittedly was never especially thick to begin with. She leaned across the table, glass in hand, grinning at me like we were sharing some private joke between sisters. "Relax, big sister. It's just dinner. You can afford it." I set my water down slowly. "Afford what?" "This." She gestured broadly at the table, the platters, the wine, the 16 place settings, the creme brulee and soufflé currently being prepared by a kitchen that had absolutely no idea it was catering a shakedown. "We ordered the good stuff since you're treating." "Since you're treating." She said it so casually, like it was a decision made in some meeting I simply hadn't been invited to, which, of course, it had been. The table went quiet for about 3 seconds, which doesn't sound like long until you're the one actually sitting inside it. My mother shot Brooke a look that unmistakably read too early, and Brooke just shrugged the way you shrug after knocking over a vase you have no intention of picking back up. Uncle Greg suddenly found his lobster fascinating. Aunt Linda studied her napkin like it contained secrets. My father cleared his throat. The silence lasted just long enough for Nathan to arrive with a fresh bottle of sparkling water, set it down beside my glass without a word, and for me to fully understand 2 things at once. First, Nathan was the only single person at that entire table who had poured me something without expecting anything back in return. And second, my sister had just confirmed out loud, in front of 16 witnesses, exactly what everyone at that table already understood in silence. I was the mark. This whole dinner was a heist, and every single lobster tail on that table was evidence. What happened next was accidental, and I actually felt a little bad for cousin Megan once it landed. She was genuinely trying to make conversation, I think, because Megan was the one relative who'd sent me a short, "thinking of you" text on my birthday during year 2 of the silence, a message I never replied to and still feel a little guilty about, honestly. "So, Vanessa, Mom said you got some big promotion." Something about running a bunch of restaurants now. Megan nodded, genuinely impressed. That's amazing. Like, you're in charge of all of it. Staffing, vendors, compliance, financials. Everything from the loading dock to the final check, I said, the exact same way I'd say it in any ordinary business meeting, factual, unpolished, no flourish attached. But that single word, financials, landed on that table like a rock going straight through a window. Aunt Linda's fork froze midair. Uncle Greg actually looked up from his plate for the first time in 10 solid minutes. Brooke's scrolling thumb went completely still. Even my father shifted in his seat, visibly recalculating something in real time. They already knew, in the abstract, that I was successful. Their entire evening had been built around the assumption that I was successful enough to cover the check. But actually hearing the scope of it, the authority, the specificity of what I really did every single day, was an entirely different thing than simply assuming it. They had pictured a well-paid waitress who'd gotten a lucky break somewhere along the way. They had not pictured someone who could read a profit and loss statement faster than they could read a dinner menu, who negotiated vendor contracts worth more than their house, who knew down to the cent exactly what 16 lobster tails and 2 bottles of that Bordeaux would cost before the check ever hit the table. The whole table recalibrated. I could actually feel it happen, like a shift in barometric pressure right before a storm. The power hadn't fully changed hands yet, but it had definitely loosened its grip. My father waited until dessert to make his move. Strategic, I'll give him that much credit. The soufflé had arrived. The crème brûlée sat cracked open. The second bottle of Bordeaux was upside down in the ice bucket. The whole table had gone warm and slow and full, softened by sugar and wine, wearing that particular satisfaction that only comes from eating a meal you never paid for and never intended to. My father set down his fork. He folded his hands together on the edge of the table, a gesture I'd watched him make right before signing contracts, right before delivering speeches at holiday dinners, right before he told me, at 23 years old, that he needed a co-signer just this once. He looked at me. Not unkindly. Not cruelly. With the exact expression of a man who genuinely believes he is being completely reasonable. Vanessa. He smiled. You're paying, right? You owe us that much. 5 words. You owe us that much. 16 people heard it. Nathan, refilling Aunt Linda's coffee cup right behind my chair, heard it. The couple seated at the next table, pretending very hard not to be listening, heard it too. My mother nodded along in agreement. My sister smirked into her wine glass. My aunt reached for another pat of butter, as if the entire matter had already been settled. You owe us 3 years of silence. And not one single person sitting at that table had said, even once that night, that they were sorry, or that they'd been wrong, or that they'd missed me for any reason other than the number attached to my credit limit. I looked at my father across a table absolutely wrecked by a meal I never ordered, surrounded by a family I hadn't even been warned would show up, holding a glass of water I'd poured for myself, and I felt something I genuinely had not expected to feel. Relief. Because the decision I'd been terrified to make for weeks had just been made for me, in front of 16 witnesses, in 5 short words. I didn't answer him right away. I've learned that silence does far more work than any sentence can in a room full of people who are used to being agreed with instantly. 3 seconds. 5. The specific kind of silence that makes an entire table shift in their seats, reach for their water glasses, and suddenly find something urgently interesting to look at on the wall behind you. For 15 years, I picked up every check so nobody would ever make a scene. I co-signed every loan, covered every security deposit, paid every dental bill and florist invoice, because the actual cost of saying no had always been a room exactly like this one full of staring, waiting faces. All silently agreed that my love was measured strictly in dollars, and my silence had a fixed purchase price. 15 years. Thousands and thousands of dollars. And the price of admission back into my own family had just been announced, out loud, to the entire room, at roughly $80 a plate, plus wine, plus lobster, plus whatever particular tax comes attached to being the one child they only ever call when something needs funding. I looked at my father's still folded hands. I looked at my mother's warm, still performing eyes. I looked at Brooke, already back to scrolling, because as far as she was concerned this had already been decided days ago in a group chat I was never part of. I looked at Nathan, standing quietly by the service station, watching with the careful attention of a young man who clearly understands something important is unfolding at his table, even if he can't say exactly what. Then I looked down at my sparkling water, half full, catching the candlelight like a small, quiet promise I had already made to myself back in that bathroom. I set my napkin down on the table. I smiled. Let me go take care of things, I said, and stood up. My mother exhaled with visible relief. Aunt Linda patted her own chest. My father unfolded his hands. Every single person at that table assumed, without a shadow of doubt, that I was walking off to pay the bill. Here's the thing: 15 years behind a host stand teaches you, if you're paying attention, whoever controls the check controls the entire room. My family believed they controlled that room. They'd chosen the restaurant, curated the menu, assembled the audience, and delivered the demand right on schedule. They had 16 people, 2 full bottles of wine, and 3 years of built-up pressure working in their favor. I had 2 sentences, and a 19-year-old waiter named Nathan. If a quiet boundary has ever completely rearranged your whole life, if you've ever walked into a room where every single person expected you to fold and you simply didn't, go ahead and hit subscribe right now, because you're going to want to see exactly how this one lands. I didn't walk toward the front register. I walked to the service station tucked in the back of the dining room, where Nathan was organizing check presenters beside a floor manager named David, who was reviewing a ticket. David wore the standard uniform, black shirt, black tie, earpiece, carrying the look of someone who'd been in this industry long enough to handle absolutely anything that walked up to his podium. I walked straight up to him. "Excuse me, David." He turned with a professional smile already in place. "How can I help you?" I kept my voice low. Not dramatic. Not conspiratorial. Just the specific volume you use in this business when you're handling something that doesn't need the entire dining room's attention. Nathan stood beside him, listening, a tray balanced on one hip, both of them watching me with the immediate, precise attention that restaurant professionals give someone who's clearly speaking their language fluently. I said 2 sentences. "I'm not the host tonight, and I won't be covering this table. Please bring the full check to the gentleman at the head of the table, the one whose card is already on file for the reservation." David blinked once, glanced at Nathan, looked back at me. "And second thing," I continued, "split my sparkling water off onto its own separate check and add 30% gratuity to mine, for your whole team. You've all earned it tonight." Nathan's eyes widened slightly. David studied me for a full 3 seconds, reading the situation the exact way a good floor manager reads any situation: fast, thorough, completely without judgment. Then he simply nodded. Done. That was it. No argument. No hesitation. "No, are you sure about this, ma'am?" Because David had clearly done this job long enough to instantly recognize a redirect when he saw one, and Nathan had been watching that table closely enough all evening to understand exactly why one was necessary. I paid my own check right there on the spot, 1 sparkling water, 2 refills, plus a 30% tip that would end up being the largest single tip Nathan had received all month. David ran my card, handed me the receipt, and said quietly, "I'll bring the table's check out in about 10 minutes, once the dessert plate's clear." Perfect. I walked back to the table, sat down, picked my water glass back up, and took a slow, deliberate sip. Brooke was arguing with cousin Tyler about a reality show. Aunt Linda was telling Uncle Greg about a neighbor's fence dispute. My mother watched me with the relaxed, satisfied attention of a woman who assumed the check had already been fully handled. My father leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, thoroughly pleased with himself. 16 people finishing dessert, draining the last of a $400 bottle of wine, waiting on a bill they had absolutely no intention of ever actually seeing. I set my glass down and waited right along with them. Those 10 minutes turned out to be the most peaceful stretch of my entire evening. The table had no idea yet, but the meal was already over in every way that actually mattered. The food had been eaten. The wine was gone. The demand had been made out loud. And the answer had already been delivered, quietly, in a language not one person at that table happened to speak. I sat at my end and simply listened. Aunt Linda complained at length about the cost of mulch. Uncle Greg told a fishing story that never arrived at an ending. Brooke took a selfie with the souffle remains behind her. My mother laughed at something, and cousin Megan laughed too, a real laugh this time, the kind that crinkles up your eyes, and for exactly 3 seconds, she sounded like the girl who used to sing along in the kitchen with me. I almost felt something soften. Almost. Then I glanced at my father, checking his phone under the table with the tight-jawed focus of a man waiting for a text he was actively dreading. And I remembered exactly what I'd read on Brooke's phone 40 minutes earlier. Vanessa can cover us through spring. She's got more than enough. My sparkling water caught the candlelight again. I watched the bubbles rise up and pop, one by one, each one a tiny silent implosion nobody else at that table even noticed. I thought about 17-year-old me in her apron, stacking 4 plates up one aching forearm, learning to smile straight through the burn in her shoulders. That girl would have paid the entire bill without a second thought. She'd have pulled out her card, covered the whole table, called it love, driven home, cried quietly in the shower, and never told a single soul about any of it. I wasn't that girl anymore. Not tonight. Nathan appeared at the edge of the alcove, and I knew exactly whose chair he was walking toward before he'd even taken his first step. He placed the leather check presenter, embossed with the Camarel's gold logo, directly in front of my father. Not in the center of the table. Not anywhere near me. Right in front of Raymond Mayfield, the man who'd made the reservation, whose card had been sitting on file since the beginning of the evening, who had told the entire table 2 hours earlier to put it all on this. The conversation at that table died out instantly, like a candle caught in a sudden draft. My father stared down at that leather folio for a solid 2 seconds. I could actually watch him process it in real time. The check was supposed to go to Vanessa. The check was supposed to go to Vanessa. The check is sitting in front of me. My mother's eyes went wide. She looked at me, then down at the check, then back at me again, and for the very first time all evening, her composure cracked just enough to reveal the math running frantically behind it. Vanessa, she started. My father recovered first. He was always good at recovering, 63 years old, and he had never once, in my entire lifetime, openly admitted to being caught off guard. He picked up the folio, flicked it open with practiced casualness, and did not look at the total. He couldn't look at the total, not in front of 16 people, because if he looked at that number, the entire performance would collapse instantly. I've got it, he said, pulling a credit card from his wallet with that same 2-finger flourish from earlier. He handed the card straight to Nathan without breaking eye contact with me. We're celebrating, remember? Nathan took the card. I'll be right back, sir, he said gently, the exact tone you use when you already know what's about to happen and the person across from you very much doesn't. Nathan came back 4 minutes later. Same gentle lean, same quiet voice. I'm sorry, sir. The card's been declined. Nobody at that table moved a muscle. My father's smile held on for 1 more second, like a light switch flipped off, but the bulb still glowing on residual current. Then it went dark completely. Run it again, he said. Nathan nodded and disappeared. He returned 2 minutes later. Same lean. Same voice. I'm sorry, sir. It's still not going through. My father reached back into his wallet. Fingers moving through the card slots, one, then another, then a third one he pulled from a hidden slot behind his driver's license, like the last round in a chamber he'd forgotten he'd even loaded. He handed it over to Nathan. The whole table sat in total silence. 16 people. Not one fork moving. Not one drop of wine being poured. Nothing but the sound of my father's 63 years of pride slowly compressing itself into a wallet he couldn't seem to close fast enough. Nathan returned a third time. He didn't even need to say anything at all. His face said it for him. My father looked at Nathan. Then he looked at me, not with anger yet, not in that moment. With the raw, completely unguarded expression of a man who has just realized, in front of every single person who matters to him, that the safety net he'd been silently counting on this entire evening was simply gone. And the ground beneath him was exactly as hard as he'd always secretly feared it would be. He looked at me the way you look at a lifeboat pulling steadily away from a sinking ship. I picked my sparkling water back up, took a slow sip, and set it back down. I don't owe you, I said quietly. I never did. My father's chair scraped back against the hardwood floor with a sound like tearing paper. Vanessa. His voice had gone low, controlled, shaking slightly at the very edges. What did you do? I didn't do anything, Dad. Your card was declined. That's a conversation between you and your bank. You were supposed to. He caught himself a half-second too late. The sentence hung in the air, fully visible to all 16 people at that table. You were supposed to pay. My mother started crying. Not the quiet kind, the performative kind, complete with gasps and dramatic dabbing, loud enough to pull sympathetic glances from the tables around us. After everything we've done for you, after I carried you. And what exactly did you do for me, Mom? My voice stayed level. I didn't raise it once. I didn't lean forward. I stayed right in my seat, both hands wrapped around my water glass. Tell me, in front of everyone here right now, what did you do for me in the last 3 years? Brooke slammed her palm flat on the table. This is so typical. You always have to make everything about you. Aunt Linda reached for my arm. Vanessa, dear, your father is clearly embarrassed. Can't you just? No. One single word, delivered the exact same way I'd say it to a vendor trying to shortchange an invoice, clear, final, and completely without apology. Then my father broke, but not with anger this time. Something far worse than anger. His voice dropped low, and for one brief, genuinely honest moment, he sounded like a man standing alone inside a house with every light switched off. "Vanessa, please. We're drowning." I saw him then. Really saw him. The frightened man underneath the entire performance. The father who'd quietly lost his business and his pride and couldn't say either one out loud until his own credit card finally said it for him. I saw him, and something in my chest genuinely ached. Then he added one more sentence. "And you'd let us." And the ache stopped instantly. Because even drowning, even in that raw, honest moment, he was still reaching for my wallet instead of my hand. I stood up. Not fast. Not dramatic. The way you stand once a decision has already been made, and you no longer need the room's permission to walk away from it. "Dad, I'm genuinely sorry you're struggling. I mean that." I gestured at the table, the wrecked platters, the empty bottles turned upside down, 16 faces staring at me like I'd just become the villain in a story they'd all rehearsed together for a full week. But this isn't asking for help. This is a trap. You didn't invite me here to make amends. You invited me here to make a payment. My mother's crying shifted into something sharper. "That's not fair, Vanessa. We just wanted you back. You wanted me back for what I could cover, Mom." I read the messages. "She can cover us through spring." The entire table went white. Brooke's face drained of all color. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. My father stared down hard at the tablecloth. "If you need real help," I said, "actual help, I will sit down with you and a financial counselor, and we will figure out a plan together. No tricks. No audience. No lobster. But I am not paying this bill. I didn't order it. Nobody told me it was coming. And I do not owe it to any of you." I picked my purse up off the floor. I looked at my mother one last time, and I said the final thing I would say to her at that table. "You always told me family takes care of family. So why was I the only one who ever actually did?" Then I walked toward the door, past the busser, past the hostess stand, past those heavy glass doors with the brass handles. Nathan caught up to me near the coat check, holding out my receipt. "Ma'am." Quiet. Sincere. "Thank you." I touched his shoulder gently. "You're doing great," I told him again. Then I walked out into the night. The parking lot was quiet. A warm Thursday evening, cicadas already starting up in the landscape trees that made the Camarel look like it belonged somewhere far more important than a strip mall. I sat in my car with the engine off and the window rolled down, reading the sticky note still stuck to my steering wheel. "One dinner, then home. One dinner." I pulled my phone out of my purse and opened the family group chat. Messages were already pouring in, my mother, Aunt Linda, Brooke, cousins I hadn't heard a word from in years, everyone typing at once, a cascade of exclamation points and accusations. That particular flavor of fury that only exists in people who've just been caught red-handed. I didn't read a single one of them. I scrolled straight to the bottom, tapped leave group, and watched the notification confirm it instantly. "Vanessa has left the chat." I set the phone down on the passenger seat, started the engine, and drove home through the exact same silence I'd driven through on the way there. Except this time, that silence wasn't nervous. It was entirely mine. If you've made it this far, drop a comment right now. One word is fine. Just let me know you're still with me, because the aftermath is where this story really finishes landing. The aftermath turned out quieter than I expected. Nobody called that night. Nobody called the next day, or the day after that either. The group chat I'd left kept right on running without me, I know, because cousin Megan, the same one who'd sent that birthday text 2 years into the silence, reached out to me separately about a week later. "I just wanted you to know," she wrote, "that was the most honest thing anyone's done at a family dinner in 20 years. I'm sorry I was part of it." Megan was the only one who ever apologized. 3 weeks after that, Brooke texted, not to apologize, but to ask if I could lend her first and last month's rent on a new apartment. I sent back the name of a financial counseling service and wished her well. She never responded. Through Megan, I pieced together the rest over the following months. My father's contracting business had actually folded 18 months before that dinner ever happened, a couple of bad bets on commercial projects that went sideways on him. My mother had been covering minimum payments across 4 separate credit cards using a home equity line that was already maxed out. The house went up for sale that July. They moved into a smaller rental about 30 minutes south of where they'd always lived. Brooke took a job answering phones at a dentist's office. None of that was what I ever wanted for them. All of it was the direct consequence of choices they'd made long before I ever walked through those glass doors at the Camarel. And none of it, not one piece of it, was actually mine to fix. I did keep the one promise I made at that table. I called my father 6 weeks later and offered, again, to sit down with him and a financial counselor. He hung up on me. I haven't called since. But that offer still stands, exactly as it did that night. What I learned, in the end, is that the single most expensive thing you can ever purchase is other people's comfort with your own silence. And the night I finally stopped paying for it was the same night I finally got rich, not in the way anyone at that table would have measured it, but in the only way that ever actually mattered to me. That's the whole story. 16 chairs, 1 glass of sparkling water, and a credit card that finally told the truth nobody else at that table was willing to say out loud. If you've ever been the family bank, hear me clearly on this one. Helping the people you love is always a choice. It was never supposed to be a debt. And a boundary doesn't have to be loud or dramatic or delivered in front of an audience to be completely unbreakable. Share this with somebody who needs to hear exactly that today. Tell me in the comments what you would have done differently sitting in that chair. And hit subscribe, because there are a lot more stories exactly like this one still coming, and you are not going to want to miss the next one. I'll see you there.